and they say that contentment is a virtue. They tell you to be grateful for the crumb on your plate, for the roof that leaks only when it pours, and for the silence that fills the empty spaces of your life. They are lying. Contentment, when born of fear rather than fulfillment, is a slow-acting poison. And it is a narcotic that dulls the senses, convincing you that the walls closing in around you are actually a warm embrace. It keeps you small, it keeps you quiet, and eventually it buries you in a grave that you dug for yourself, one compromise at a time. Elian lived in the shadow of the Colossus, a jagged and towering mountain that blocked the sun for 18 hours of the day. The village of Umbra sat at its base, and a cluster of mud, brick hovels that clung to the earth like barnacles on a dying whale. In Umbra, the currency was not gold or silver, but coal. Every man, woman, and child was born with a soot stain on their soul and a pickaxe in their future. They dug, they scraped, they survived. That was the extent of their vocabulary. Survive. And to dream of anything else was considered not just foolish, but dangerous. And it was seen as an insult to the ancestors who had broken their backs just to keep the fire burning for one more night. Elian was the poorest among them, and not because he lacked strength, but because he lacked the rhythm of the mines. While other men swung their picks with a mindless, hypnotic cadence, Elian paused, and he looked at the veins of the rock. He studied the architecture of the tunnels. He traced the fault lines with his calloused fingertips, his eyes unfocused, and looking through the stone rather than at it. He was 25 years old, thin as a reed, with clothes that were more patch than fabric, and he was the laughingstock of the lower quarry. Look at him. The foreman, a brute of a man named Kale, would sneer, and spitting black flame onto the ground near Elian's boots. The dreamer is awake, calculating how to turn dust into diamonds, our wee boy. The other miners would chuckle, and a dry, rasping sound like dry leaves scraping over concrete. Just dig, Elian, they would say. The mountain doesn't care about your thoughts, and it only cares about your muscle. But Elian couldn't just dig. His poverty wasn't just a lack of coal, and it was a devastating hunger for something he couldn't name until he saw the old map. He had found it years ago, and rotting in the binding of a discarded book in the refuse pile. It depicted the world before the Great Ash, a time when the Colossus wasn't a prison wall, but a gateway, and the map showed that behind the sheer, impossible cliff face of the mountain lay a valley called Aethelgard, a place of endless sun, fertile soil, and rivers that ran clear as crystal. The people of Umbra didn't believe in Aethelgard. They called it a myth, a fairy tale told to crying children to make them sleep, and they believed the world ended at the mountain. They believed their reality of soot and coughing sickness was the only reality that existed. But Elian had done the math, and he had watched the migration of the birds. He had felt the specific warmth of the wind currents that trickled down from the highest crevices. He knew, and with a terrifying certainty, that the paradise was real. He also knew that to reach it, they didn't need to climb over the mountain, they needed to go through it, and he spent his nights not sleeping but drawing. By the flickering light of a candle that smelled of rendered fat, Elian sketched a machine. It was a drill, but not like the hand cranks they used. It was massive, a system of gears, pulleys, and counterweights, and designed to harness the power of the underground river that flowed uselessly beneath the mines to drive a diamond-tipped bore. And it was a project that would require the labor of the entire village for a year. It would require them to stop digging for coal, which meant risking freezing, and to build something that might not work. It was a thought so big it terrified him. Who was he? A man with holes in his boots, and a man who had eaten nothing but boiled roots for 3 days. Who was he to tell the elders that their way of life was obsolete? And the turning point came in the dead of winter. The coal veins in the lower quarry ran dry. Panic set in like a frost. The elders gathered in the town square, and their faces gaunt, their breath pluming in the freezing air. They spoke of rationing. They spoke of sending the children to the deep shafts, the dangerous ones, and where the air was thin and the roofs were unstable, to scrape out the last remnants of fuel. Elian stood at the back of the crowd, and his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He clutched his schematics to his chest, the paper warm from his body heat. He knew this was the moment, and the desperation was palpable. It was a physical weight in the air. He pushed his way to the front. "Stop!" he shouted. His voice cracked, unused to commanding attention, and we cannot send the children down there. The structural integrity is gone. It will collapse. And what do you propose, Elian? The chief elder asked, and his voice wary and edged with irritation. That we freeze. That we starve politely. No, Elian said, his hands shaking as he unrolled the large and charcoal-stained parchment. We build this. We pierce the wall. Behind the Colossus is Aethelgard. There is wood for fires, sun for crops, water that doesn't taste of iron, and we don't need to scavenge anymore. We can live like kings. Silence descended on the square. It wasn't the silence of awe, it was the silence of confusion, and Kale stepped forward, looking at the complex drawing of gears and tunnels. He squinted, unable to comprehend the scale of the mechanics. And, you want us to stop mining? Kale said slowly, looking at the crowd, to build a toy. You want us to starve on the promise of a fairy tale, and it's not a fairy tale? Elian pleaded, pointing to the wind currents he had mapped. The birds fly over the ridge. The wind comes from the east warm, not cold. And the mountain is hollow in parts. If we strike here, at these coordinates, the rock is thin. We can break through in 3 months if we work together. And 3 months, a woman screamed from the crowd. My baby will be dead in 3 weeks without heat. If we stay here, we all die anyway, Elian yelled back, and his fear replaced by a sudden, hot anger. Don't you see? You are digging your own graves. You are thinking about the next hour, the next meal, and you need to think about the next generation. We are slaves to this mountain because you are too afraid to master it. The slap echoed across the square, and Kale had struck him, a backhanded blow that sent Elian sprawling into the mud. The parchment flew from his hands, landing in a puddle of slush. And you dare call us cowards? Kale roared, his face purple with rage. We work until our hands bleed. We sacrifice everything, and you sacrifice your potential for safety. Elian spat blood staining his teeth. He scrambled to grab his map, but Cal stepped on it, grinding his heavy and iron-toed boot into the paper, tearing the delicate charcoal lines, destroying the months of calculation, the dreams of a green valley. There is no valley. Cal growled, and leaning down, his face inches from Elian's. There is only the rock, and there is only the work. You are a poison to this village, Elian, and you give false hope to desperate people. That is the cruelest crime of all. The chief elder looked down at Elian, his eyes cold and hard. Kale is right, and we cannot afford dreamers. Not this winter. You have disrupted the order. You have incited panic. I offered you salvation, Elian whispered, and the cold seeping into his bones. You offered us a delusion, the elder said. Leave Umbra. Take your rags and your crazy thoughts and go. If the valley is real, and go find it. But do not return here. The banishment was immediate. They didn't even let him pack his few belongings. Elian was marched to the edge of the village and past the last flickering torch and shoved into the darkness of the outer passes. The wind here was a knife, sharp and relentless. He walked for hours, and simply because stopping meant freezing to death. The adrenaline of the confrontation faded, replaced by a crushing despair. He fell to his knees in the snow, and his body racking with sobs. They were right. He was a fool. A poor, arrogant fool who thought he was smarter than centuries of tradition. He looked down at his hands, and they were empty. The map was gone. The machine was a fantasy. He had nothing, no home, no friends, no food. The cold began to numb his fingers and toes, and it would be so easy to just lie down, to close his eyes, to accept the smallness of his fate, to be content with the end. But as he lay there, and his cheek pressed against the frozen granite of the mountain base, he heard something. It was faint, barely a vibration, felt more than heard. Thrum, thrum, and he lifted his head. He pressed his ear harder against the rock face. It wasn't the wind. It was rhythmic. It was constant. It was water. Deep, deep inside the rock, and millions of tons of water were rushing with violent force. The underground river. The very power source he had tried to explain to them. It was real. He wasn't crazy, and the physics were sound. The mountain wasn't solid. It was a shell hiding a torrent. Elian stood up. His legs were weak, trembling with hypothermia, but a fire had ignited in his chest that was hotter than any coal furnace in Umbra. They had taken his map. They had taken his home. But they couldn't take his mind, and they couldn't take the vision. He looked up at the sheer cliff face, rising thousands of feet into the darkness. He had no drill. He had no crew. He had no dynamite, and he had only a rusted, broken pickaxe he had managed to keep hooked to his belt. Fine, he whispered to the wind, his voice raspy but steady. If they won't build the door, and I will become the door. He didn't need to break the whole mountain. He just needed to find the weak point, the keystone that, if removed, and would let the water do the work for him. He remembered the map. He remembered the fault line. It was high up, a treacherous climb on icy rocks in the dark, and he began to climb. The climb was an act of madness. The wind howled around the jagged spire of the Colossus, and a physical force that tried to peel Elian from the rock face like a dead leaf. His fingers were no longer fingers, they were frozen claws of bone and raw meat, and hooked into crevices barely an inch deep. Every muscle in his body screamed in agony, begging him to let go, to fall into the soft, welcoming silence of the snow below. But Elian's mind was not on the pain. It was locked onto a coordinate, 70 meters up, 12 degrees east, the resonator fissure, and he moved not with the strength of his body, but with the momentum of his vision. When his foot slipped, sending a shower of pebbles into the abyss, he didn't panic, and he visualized the gears of his machine. He visualized the pressure of the water. He visualized the valley. The vision pulled him upward when his muscles failed, and this was the secret. The village didn't understand. The body has limits, but a thought, a truly massive, defiant thought, is infinite. And he reached the ledge just as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the sky. He was higher than he had ever been. Below him, and the village of Umbra was a smudge of gray ash, insignificant and silent. Elian crawled toward the fissure. It was exactly where his calculations said it would be, a long and jagged crack in the obsidian rock, steaming slightly. He pressed his cheek against it. The mountain was vibrating. The roar of the subterranean river was deafening here, and a dragon trying to claw its way out of a cage. The rock face was thin. The pressure behind it was immense. He unhooked the rusted pickaxe from his belt, and it was a pathetic tool against a mountain. Kale would have laughed. The elders would have shaken their heads. But Elian saw what they couldn't, and he didn't need to destroy the mountain. He just needed to introduce a fatal flaw. He needed to be the catalyst. He found the stress point, a small and wedge-shaped rock that was holding the tension of the entire fault line. For the dreamers, Elian rasped, his voice lost in the wind. He swung. Clang. Sparks flew, and the vibration in the rock intensified. The hum became a low growl. He swung again. Clang. The shockwave traveled up his arms, shattering the feeling in his elbows, and he screamed with the effort, channeling every insult, every hunger pang, a moment of being called, fool, into the swing. Think IG, he roared, and bringing the pickaxe down a third time with every ounce of life he had left. Crock. The sound wasn't like stone breaking, it sounded like the spine of the world snapping, and the wedge rock shattered. For a second, there was absolute silence. Then a spiderweb of white fractures shot out from the impact point, and spreading faster than the eye could follow, racing up the cliff face and down toward the base. The mountain groaned, a deep, tectonic sorrow, and Elian threw himself backward onto a higher ledge just as the wall exploded. It wasn't a landslide, it was a deluge. A jet of pressurized water, thick as a house, and blasted outward with the force of a bomb. The trapped river, liberated after a millennia of darkness, tore through the granite skin of the Colossus, and the sheer force of the water acted like a hydraulic cannon, carving through the rock, widening the hole, eating away the barrier that had blocked the sun for centuries. And down in Umbra, the villagers woke to the sound of the apocalypse. Kale ran out of his hut, looking up, expecting death. The elders huddled in the square, and watching as the side of the unmovable mountain dissolved into a cloud of mist and thunder. They fell to their knees, covering their heads, waiting for the end, but the end didn't come. The water carved a path, cascading down the side of the mountain away from the village, washing into the dried riverbeds, and turning the black dust into mud, and then washing the mud away. And then the impossible happened. Through the massive hole the water had punched in the cliff, and a beam of light shot through. It was not the pale, gray light they were used to. It was gold. It was blinding. It sliced through the eternal gloom of Umbra, and hitting the town square with the intensity of a divine spotlight. The villagers squinted, shielding their eyes. Kyle stood up, his mouth agape, and through the shattered gap in the mountain, framed by the mist of the waterfall, lay a vista of green, lush, vibrant forests, fields of tall grass rippling in the wind, and a sky so blue it looked painted. Aethelgard, it was real. A silence fell over Umbra, heavier than the suit. It was the silence of a paradigm shattering. For generations, and they had believed the world was small, dark, and hard. They had believed survival was the highest goal. They had mocked the man who told them otherwise. High above them, and wet and shivering, Elian stood on the precipice. The sun from the valley hit his face, warming his frozen skin. He looked down at the village, small, shocked, and bathed in the light he had delivered to them. He began the long descent. When he reached the bottom, hours later, the entire village was waiting. No one spoke, and the arrogance was gone from Kale's face, replaced by a look of profound shame. The elders bowed their heads, unable to meet his gaze. Elian walked through the crowd, and he didn't look triumphant. He didn't gloat. He looked tired, but his eyes were burning with a terrifying intensity. He stopped in front of the chief elder. "And the pass is open," Elian said softly. "The water will drive mills. The soil in the valley will grow grain. You will never starve again. We didn't know." The elder stammered. "We couldn't see it." "You didn't see it, because you were looking at the rock," Elian said, and his voice carrying to every ear in the crowd. "You were obsessed with the obstacle. You forgot that the obstacle is just a detail. The vision is the reality." And Kale stepped forward, falling to his knees in the mud. He took Elian's hand, the hand he had smashed, the hand he had mocked. "Forgive me, Elian. I am a strong man, but I was weak in spirit. I thought big muscles made a man. You showed us that a big mind moves mountains." Elian pulled Kale up. "Strength is needed, Kale, and we will need your strength to build the new city in the valley. But never again let your fear decide the size of your world." The migration began the next day, and they left the hovels. They left the mines. They left the graves of their ancestors, knowing that the best way to honor them was to live a life of abundance, not suffering. And years later, Umbra was no longer a pit of coal. It was the gateway city to the Golden Valley. Travelers came from all over the world to see the Great Arch and the massive hole in the mountain where the river flowed. And in the center of the town square, they didn't build a statue of a warrior or a king. And they built a statue of a young man holding a rolled-up map, looking not at the ground, but through the stone. The inscription at the base read, "And the world is only as small as your imagination. To change your reality, you must first have the courage to think beyond it." And Elian's story reminds us that poverty is not just a lack of money, it is a lack of ambition. The people of Umbra were poor not because the mountain was there, but because they accepted the mountain as their limit. Elian was rich long before he found the valley, because he carried the valley inside his mind. And there will always be people who tell you to be realistic. There will always be people who say, "Just dig." They will laugh at your plans. They will trample your maps. But remember, they are digging in the dark because they are afraid of the light you carry. Do not lower your vision to match their reality. Raise your hammer and find the weak point in your fear and strike until the walls come down. If this story touched your heart and awakened the giant within you, subscribe to Mindset Millionaire for more stories that will change the way you see the world.